This module is on demography. Demography really is the study of population behavior. After studying this module, you will be able to know about various demographic concepts, theories, and so on, and also analyze how India's population has behaved over the years. In the introduction, let's talk about a few basic demographic concepts. The first is the rate of growth. The rate of growth of the population depends on the birth rate and the death rate and the rate of external migration. However, for a big country like India, external migration is not so important. Thus, the rate of growth of population in India, for example, is really birth rate minus death rate. Another important concept is that concept of life expectancy. Life expectancy is the number of years a person is expected on birth to live on an average. Infant mortality is the death rate of babies who are just one short of 1 year, that is up to 364 days old. Working population. Working population is the population in the age group of 15 to 64 years, presumed to be able to contribute to the GDP. Dependency rate. Dependency rate is the ratio of the dependents to the working age population. Now, let's look at some demographic trends.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know various demographic concepts and theories. Learn about demographic trends in India before and after independence. Identify the various phases of demographic trends in India. Evaluate the contribution of population to economic growth. Analyze the factors behind India's population behavior. Let us first discuss some basic demographic concepts. The rate of growth of population depends on the birth rate and the death rate. It can be written as BR minus DR, the rates being calculated per thousand. Life expectancy is the number of years a person is expected to live on birth on an average. Infant mortality rate is the death rate of babies up to 364 days old. Working population is the population in the age group of 15 to 64 years, presumed to be able to contribute to production. Dependency rate is the ratio of dependents, people younger than 15 or older than 64, to the working age population. Demographic dividend is the addition to economic growth due to dependency ratio getting reduced and the proportion of working population getting increased.
The first ever population head count or census started in 1867 under the East India Company. Then under the Crown rule, that is rule of the British Empire, from 1872 they started regular collection of population statistics, or what is known as decennial census. Decennial means 10 yearly. 10 yearly census really started from 1872, and we have roughly a more or less continuous series like 1872, then 1881, 1891, and so it has gone on and is going on still. In 1881, for example, the rate of growth of the population was 1.11%. In 1941, we find that the rate of growth of the population, average and annual, was 1.40. So like this, we can look at how the rate of growth of population in India has behaved. We find a very interesting feature here that in around 1921, which is known as the year of the Great Divide, there was a change or a transition in the population behavior. Before that, the rate of growth of population was very slow, minimal suffering and so on. After 1921, the rate of growth of population began to grow steadily, and this is what led ultimately to what is known as the population explosion. We sometimes say India is overpopulated, India is having population explosion. This really started from around 1921. In general, however, before independence, we find that life expectancy was very, very low. It was in around 1921, it was only 23, not even 30s. And around independence, it came to about 32. So that's not very promising for any growing economy. Similarly, the infant mortality rate was pretty high. I mean, you were not certain, you were not at all sure of how long a baby, a newborn baby, was going to live. It was the death rate, the deaths of young people, they were really very, very disappointing. There are various hypotheses about this. Why was it like this? Why was 1921 the year of the Great Divide? The most accepted hypothesis is that of Sumit Guha, who said that because in 1921 there were very good harvests, population rate of growth steadied. That is, the death rate was less and birth rate and death rate, somehow there was a positive balance between them which was continued. So it is not the British rule, it is not the growth of immunities as claimed by others, earlier ones, but it is really the fact that we simply had the weather gods being kind to us. There is yet another hypothesis, that by Cole and Hoover, and this is also very interesting for India. This theory says that birth rates and death rates are both high in the first initial stages of a country's economic growth. Both being high, the rate of growth of population is low. Then birth rate remains high, but death rate becomes low because of better hospital and medical facilities and so on, and population begins to grow. This is probably one phenomenon, one cause of the 1921 change, the 1921 watershed in India. In the third stage of demographic transition, death rate is already low, but now birth rate also becomes low, so that the gap between them closes again and rate of growth of population again becomes low. In India's case, however, we find that this third stage of demographic transition, if at all, it has started only in the 1970s. After independence, we find the second stage only continuing. We still have very high birth rates, death rate has slowed down, but there is a considerable gap between the two. Take for example 1941-51. 1941-51, inclusive of independence and so on, the birth rate was 39.9, death rate was 27.4. So how has things changed in 50 years? When we come to 2000, we find that the birth rate has fallen from 39.9 to 25.8. The death rate has fallen much more, 8.5 from 27.4. So the gap between them is still very high. The gap between them being high, we have a very high rate of growth of population still, 17.3. The rate of growth of population in 1941-51 was 12.5. In 2000, it is 17.3. So we still have a high birth rate, although in 1961-71, around that time, it has started to fall. In 1991, the rate of growth was 19.7. 2000, it has come down to 17.3. So at least it's coming down. So this is an important index of population behavior in India.
This table shows an acceleration of population growth around the year 1921. In the table, we can see that there is a significant gap between birth rate and the death rate from 1921. The death rate prior to 1921 was high and erratic, whereas birth rate prior to 1921 was high but comparatively steady, at least not erratic like the death rate. The fall in death rate occurred in 1921, while the fall in birth rate occurred only in the 1940s, that is, 2 decades later. Whatever change has taken place has been more due to the change or fall in death rate rather than any change in the birth rate. Because of this, 1921 is known as a landmark year in demographic history of India, or the year of the Great Divide. Life expectancy figures are not available before 1901, but show a steady increase after 1921, from around 23 in 1921 to around 32 by independence. Infant mortality rate was high and did not change much in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but it showed a downward trend especially from the 1920s. From 219 in 1916 to 1921, IMR came down to 161 in 1941 to 1946, and this decline started in 1921, becoming steady after 1940. Percentage figures of the deaths of the young people show a similar decline after 1921. From 62 in 1911 to 1921, it declined to 40 in 1941 to 1950, the decline starting from 1921 to 1931. The age structure was like that of a pyramid. Lots of infants were born, but fewer and fewer reached the higher age groups. The dependency ratio was very high, around 80% between 1881 and 1941. The majority of the population lived in rural areas and the extent of urbanization was very slow till 1921. Even by 1941 to 1951, 4/5 or 80% of the population was rural. The majority of the population was malnourished, unskilled, and illiterate. From these statistics, it is clear that 1921 was a demarcation line between 2 phases of population history in India, not only from the point of view of birth rates and death rates, but also from that of infant mortality rate, life expectancy, and other associated measures. Hypothesis number 1. Noted economic historian Kingsley Davis offered 2 explanations for the spurt of population growth around 1921. First was the control of famines through the development of roads, railways, and irrigation, leading to more and better crops. Second, the control of epidemics and diseases through the development of modern medicines. But another economic historian, Sumit Guha, has found fault with these 2 arguments. In regard to first point, he feels that the development of either transport and communication or area irrigated was not so remarkable in the period concerned as to stop the occurrence of famines. And for the second point, he is of the opinion that Kingsley Davis put too much faith in the effectiveness of medical and sanitary facilities in controlling epidemics and diseases. Ira Klein, yet another economic historian, is in agreement. He has found from his own study that government health measures had only a limited impact on controlling death due to diseases. Hypothesis number 2. Era Clean offered an explanation of her own, which was in terms of host-parasite relations and the growth of biological immunities. He argues that before the First World War, India had been exposed in an unusual way to dangerous microbes due to exposure to foreign people and new activities. One result of this was the spread of infection and death, and another was the development of immunological responses among survivors, which later in the post-war era kept disease fatalities limited. Mothers who had experienced the disease or epidemic but survived it passed the antibodies to the babies they had conceived or given birth to afterwards. Thus, chains of protection had begun, the protection passing from mother to the child through generations. Sumit Guha finds this a clever and appealing argument, but finds that it is not completely supported by available data. By Era Clean's logic, the immunity developed from mother should lead to a sequential or successive decline of mortality, with the improvement beginning in the lowest age group and then getting spread over succeeding ones. But Sumit Guha finds no such sequential pattern in the data. He finds an almost simultaneous improvement at all ages rather than variation across age groups. Hypothesis number 3. Sumit Guha has an explanation of his own. It is based on a study of the Bombay Deccan area that he had earlier conducted. In that study, he had found that in 1926 to 1941, the immunity in rat and human population had led to a decline of plague and influenza, and in the interwar years, there were no serious crop failures either. Thus, there were no causes for crisis mortality in that period. Through much of the 19th century, population had maintained an upward course, but the frequent occurrence of famines, epidemics, etc., causes of crisis mortality had hindered or hampered that upward course till about 1920. After 1920, such occurrences were not there, that is, causes of abnormal or crisis mortality were not there, so that the upward course of population growth could manifest itself without being hindered or hampered. He suggests that the Indian population in the second quarter of the 20th century lived longer, since the weather gods enabled it to maintain a stable level of moderate malnutrition rather than alternately plunge between adequate nutrition and serve malnutrition as it was doing earlier. This basic improvement was supplemented by the withdrawal of the plague, the non-reoccurrence of the lethal influenza, and perhaps by public health measures that checked cholera and smallpox. However, climatic change was the most important source of improvement in mortality. Thus, only in the last 25 to 26 years of British rule, there was any significant growth of population and decline of mortality, and that too cannot be fully attributed to any improvement in medicine, sanitation law, and order under British rule. Hypothesis number 4. This hypothesis is not framed specifically for India, but has certain relevance in the Indian context. Cole and Hoover have framed the theory of demographic transition, which says that as economic growth takes place in a country, its population undergoes a transition. There are three such stages in demographic transition or population growth. Both the birth rates and death rates are high, implies that the rate of growth of population is low. In the earlier stages of any society, there is a tendency to have large families. Survival upon birth is uncertain, and work requires physical stamina and a number of participants. Customs and traditions imbibe these ideas, and people develop son preference, which itself leads to a large number of births. Death rate is high because of lack of medical facilities and low nutritional levels, as is usual when the country is economically underdeveloped. Stage 2. Birth rate remains high, but death rates become low so that the rate of growth of population becomes high. In this stage, economic growth starts taking place. Standards of living, nutritional levels, and medical facilities go up. The death rate is quick to respond and becomes much lower within a decade or two. But the birth rate being determined by socio-cultural patterns, religious and other traditions is slower to respond. It falls, but much more slowly. So, the gap between the birth rate and the death rate becomes bigger or higher. That is, rate of growth of population starts to rise. Both birth rate and the death rate may be falling simultaneously at this stage, but birth rate remains high as compared to death rate. Around 1921, India must have entered this second stage of DT. Stage 3. In this third stage, DR is already low and BR also falls low, so that the rate of growth of population again becomes low, as in the first stage. We know that dr can never be zero and must have a minimum below which it cannot fall. Also, by now, sufficient time has elapsed for socio-cultural patterns and religious cum traditional influences to have changed such that the birth rate has also fallen low. However, in India, this second stage has been very late in coming. Only in the 21st century can India be said to have entered the third stage of DT. Throughout the 20th century, India was caught up in the second stage. Internal migration increased during British rule because of new economic opportunities, that is, employment in plantations, factories, etc. Revolution in long-distance transport, that is, railways, etc. Socially and economically depressed conditions in source areas, that is, caste system in eastern UP. People who declared themselves as immigrants formed 1.8% of India's total population in 1901, and this increased to 3% by 1931. Let us now have a look at some post-independence trade. These figures indicate a demographic pattern changing towards a healthier pattern. There are regional variations. Example, in Kerala, the TFR is around 1.8, which is much less than the national average of 2.6. The birth rate is -32 and the IMR is -25. Age dependency ratio is the ratio of dependents, people younger than 15 or older than 64, to the working age population. According to the World Bank, in 2011, this was measured to be 53.67%.
Yet another interesting phenomenon has been taking place in India, especially after independence. The age dependency ratio is clearly on the decline. What we find is that the number of people who are young and can contribute to the GDP, that number as a proportion of the total working population is increasing. That proportion is increasing. So we can expect more contribution to the GDP, to the national income in future. This is known as the demographic dividend. It is a dividend, meaning a kind of an extra. It is a dividend or bonus that it is coming because of this demographic feature, simply because there are more young people and these people can contribute more to the growth of the national income. This is an exceptional feature, because if we look at China, what we find is that India's working age population is growing faster than China's. So eventually what will happen is that China's young population proportionately will probably be less than India's young population out of the working population, so that although China is a big vast country with a huge population and so on, India's contribution from her growing population is or can be likely to be more. This of course will create problems of creating enough employment for them, taking better social security network for them, giving them greater education, taking care of their nutrition, various things the government still has to do. But this is a positive sign, a positive thing for the future we look forward to.
According to World Bank data, the age dependency ratio in India declining over time. In 1990, it is 71.5, which falls to 63.8 in 2000, and then fall further to 55.1 in 2010. This is leading to a certain positive effect on the economy, known as the demographic dividend. Demographic dividend refers to the rise in economic growth that may come when the dependency ratio gets reduced and the proportion of working population increases in a period of 20 to 30 years, when, due to significant reductions in child and infant mortality rates and increases in life expectancy, fertility rates falls, more women join the workforce, and in general the economy is less strained. Government policies can be more effective at the time of the demographic dividend, but the time may also see social changes such as increasing divorce rates, postponement of marriages, and growth of single-person households. Let us now compare two countries, India and China. India's working age population is growing faster than China's. Thanks to population growth, the working age population has increased in China and India since the 1980s, contributing to strong economic growth. In 2009, the share of the population aged between 15 to 64 years accounted for 73.6% and 63.9% of the population in China and India, respectively. In 2009, the mean age of the Indian population stood at 27.5 years old, significantly younger than 36.8 in China, enabling opportunities for a consumer and investment boom. The share of the working age population in China will start declining from 2014 as a result of population aging and a slowdown in population growth, mainly due to the country's one child per family policy, introduced since 1979 to curb a population explosion. China will also experience rapid aging. Meanwhile, the share of the working age population will continue rising in India, owing to its young and growing population. The different demographic trends have important implications for China and India. China's economy has been enjoying a demographic dividend, growing at an annual average of 11.2% between 2004 and 2009 in real terms, higher than 8.1% in India. But India will continue enjoying a growing and young workforce, enabling its economy to benefit from a demographic dividend in the coming years. But China's shrinking workforce from 2014 will affect economic growth prospects. However, India's working age population is less skilled than China's. In 2009, India's adult literacy rate stood at 67.7% of the population aged 15 plus, compared to 94% in China. Further, India's unemployment rate was 9.1% in 2009, while China's was 4.3%. Besides, India's population growth will create pressures on the country's inadequate infrastructure. It is estimated that by 2030, India will have overtaken China as the world's most populous country. By 2050, the UN estimates that India's population will reach 1.6 billion, compared to 1.4 billion in China. India's working age population will see period growth of 17.4% during 2010 to 2020, compared to a modest rise of 0.3% in China. China's old age dependency ratio, the production of people aged 65 plus to working age adults, will increase from 13.1% in 2010 to 18.3% by 2020, while India's old age dependency ratio will rise more gradually from 7.6% to 9.4%. These trends will put India in a demographic advantage over China, helping to increase demand and fueling economic growth. However, the challenge will be to create enough jobs, while population growth will put pressure on India's natural resources and public services. China's government policies will shift towards addressing the rapidly aging population, while the different demographic trends will provide varying consumer demand. External migration continues to be small in India, but internal migration is always occurring. Opportunities for employment, education, etc. have been a pull factor attracting migrants from rural to urban areas and from smaller towns to big cities. Inability to get employment and inflationary pressures have also created reverse pressures. For females, marriage is a significant factor. Let us now have a look at the census of 2001 reports about 307 million persons as migrants by place of birth. Out of them, about 259 million migrated from one part of the state to another, that is, from one village or town to another village or town, and 42 million from outside the country. Data on migration by last residents in India shows that the total number of migrants has been 314 million. Out of these migrants by last residents, 268 million has been intrastate migrants, those who migrated from one area of the state to another. 41 million were interstate migrants and 5.1 million had migrated from outside of the country. On the basis of net migrants by last residents during the past decade, that is, the difference between in-migration and out-migration. In India, Maharashtra stands at the top of the list with 2.3 million net migrants, followed by Delhi, Gujarat, and Haryana, as per the census. Uttar Pradesh and Bihar were the two states with largest number of net migrants migrating out of the state.
To summarize, therefore, India's population is really quite a growing and promising area, and Indian economic growth can expect a lot from it.